After the dreamy D major section, Rachmaninoff creates this huge crescendo that brings us to the climax, using the same harmonic pattern but in 3 different ways. The first one being the last moment where we hear the actual theme that we heard in the first page, complete with its melody and its harmonies, whereas the second and the third iterations of the harmonic pattern are very dramatic and use different melodic patterns that increase the passion and the desperation of this whole passage. So this last time that we hear the actual theme, I think it's best not to indulge too much in rubatos, just like we did in the previous iterations of it, because the dance is already going and there has been a moment of positivity, which is the D major section again, and this restating of the same theme gives us basically no hope left, and suggests us that we need to really give in this almost obsessive rhythm and pattern that brings us then to the climax. And this regularity is also confirmed by the fact that this time Rachmaninoff writes triplets in the right hand that are very regular. So they create a sort of cycle that cannot be broken by too many rubatos, otherwise it loses its nature. Speaking again about gravity, this theme is constructed in a way that gives us the feeling of a sort of wind gust that brings us to fly over each bar, over and over, the same kind of gust with a slightly different color depending on the harmony as always. And each beginning is sort of the spring, and it's represented by the downbeat and this figuration in the left hand that clearly goes upwards and is answered in turn by the right hand that brings us from up to down. So if we summarize what is going on, it's actually a pretty simple structure. When we do get eventually to the bar of tension that we had the previous page, this time is even more polyphonic and even more dramatic. It's clear that this time it is actually going somewhere, and I feel like here a lot of pedal is needed, and especially the most powerful gust until now that brings us to the next section with an actual push. I feel like this ascent to the chord of preparation of the dominant, the dissonant chord we already talked about in the first page, given the fact that there are so many notes, so many voices going on at the same time, the dynamic, I feel like it's the first actual moment in the whole movement where we can fully dig deep in the keys, also from a dynamic and a weight point of view, because this is clearly a point that tells us that something is going to happen. And to make this ascent as engaging as possible and still maintaining the wind concept that we had before, I think it's key not to play this F sharp that we get to with the right hand in a downwards motion. So instead we go in an upwards motion that starts from the beginning and ends just at the end of the passage, so that we have something that is actually taking off. And after the F sharp, we haven't landed yet, not at all. Instead of creating this sort of dance that revolves around each beat of the bar, this bar is the only one that has just one point of interest, which is the next one. So it's by definition a transition bar. So even after the F sharp, when we get to the B and then to the chromaticism in the middle voices, we need to keep the tension. And this is facilitated by the polyphony going on, because we have... So a bit of chromaticism, but I find especially interesting when it goes to the middle voice that wants to go to the E of the next bar. The next line is a very romantic mixture of adding tension, because Rachmaninoff starts writing in octaves, especially in the right hand, and still maintaining the nostalgia and the bitterness of the melody in the left hand, the counter melody, that is still very hopeful in a way. In this line we have two different roles, speaking again about gravity, because the left hand has a very long line, a melodic line going on, whereas the right hand, given the fact that there are so many dashes on the melody and the slurs, repeating slurs, and also the obsessiveness of the repeated note at the beginning of each triplet, gives us the fact that these two things are against each other. So this contrast is very nice if we hear it in its full power. Speaking about the right hand instead, while this beautiful cycle is going on in the left hand, the dashes, the octaves, the full octaves, and the added voicing in the middle makes us play in a more heavy way. So also considering there are a lot of repeated notes between the triplets, we have this effect that, again, like the beginning of this movement, each beat has its own importance. So this is the main, I think, difference between the two hands, and it's very difficult to mix the two at the same time. Even though the right hand needs to be played heavier, there has to be still the sense of dance and a bit of air going on, otherwise it gets too heavy for no reason. And Rachmaninoff does that exactly by indicating the slur at the beginning of each triplet. So we can maintain the two dashes that make it heavy between each triplet, but at the beginning of each triplet we have the slur that makes us go upwards in the second chord of each group of three. And as much as possible, it's difficult clearly because of the differences in hand sizes, I understand, and myself, I cannot play every single slur actually legato, but what counts is the idea of the slur, so going down and up, once again, gravity. So the two hands together really have to fight with each other. And then, as usual, we have the bar of transition that brings us finally to the climax. And between the two fighters of the previous row, clearly the one that wins is the tension and the heaviness of the right hand. So the left hand joins in and imitates exactly the same pattern of the right hand. And in this bar, it's still very important not to dynamically stop at a level and limitate the crescendo to the first few harmonic changes. So it's very important to keep the sense of direction that we're still going to arrive here. This is the actual climax. cases where there is so much tension built up from so long ago, we need, I think, not to give in the temptation of doing so much rubato / ritardando before the actual climax. Otherwise, all the pressure on the floodgates does not break. It feels like somebody is artificially opening the gates, which obviously has the opposite intention and the opposite effect as well of what is actually written. So when we go to the fortissimo, we need to break the floodgates in a very clear manner. So I personally do a slight ritardando, but almost unperceivable, because it's sort of, if well done, it adds to the breaking point. So it's the moment before the breaking, and it's a balance that is difficult to find, especially when one is caught up with the emotion. But I think it's key to making people understand that this is the maximum they will get, at least in these first sections, because of course there's going to be a second climax in this movement. For me, this climax is especially interesting, taking in consideration the structure of each bar, the way we've been doing it until now. So if before there was a gust of wind, then the kite went to the top and then back down, this climax is just gusts of wind that go upwards. There isn't a downwards until the very end of the climax, with the last harmonic change that brings us back to E minor. But until there, it's all upwards. That's the main difference, and that's what makes it so dramatic compared to the rest of it. So if we focus especially on the right hand, on making sure that we don't fully relax, physically speaking, nor mentally, in any of these chords until the very end, where we reach the next downbeat, there we can have our landing, in a sense, or the next gust of wind. And there is also added towards the end, after all the scale, a sort of group of two notes that is when the harmonic change happens, that is a sort of signal that we're going back down to the ground. The left hand, even if it's possible to play it actually legato with the fingers, I feel like in the end, given the energy, the pedal and the speed of it, it's really not worth it. But it is still, of course, necessary to maintain the same upwards and downwards motion with the hand to maintain the phrasing that we had before in the right hand. And very frequently, and I understand why, because it's very hard, I hear this acciaccatura basically taking over. So becoming a sort of downbeat and going out of tempo. I understand it's very difficult, and one wants to be safe when trying to play in that note. Also, it's very difficult to find a balance between getting emotionally involved and of course not making this a complete disaster, because there are many notes, many tricky places, and with the pedal I would definitely change on the first of the two Ds, and obviously in the second bar I'm talking about Cs, and in the third one about Bs, so that the harmony changes in the right place and the acciaccatura does not have to take in the pedal, because obviously if we take the pedal after the acciaccatura, it's going to sound way more than we already have the pedal down before. And the most interesting out of these bars of the climax, I feel like it's the last one and the last two in general, because they represent not only the failing of this last struggle of desperation that there was, but also all of it is accentuated by the way it's written, by the syncopations. And the emptiness created by the fourths. which is a very strange appoggiatura in the left hand that makes a very dissonant pattern that darkens up once again. So Rachmaninoff opened up, not in terms of positivity, unless we were talking about the D major section, but he opened up in terms of honesty about this desperation, this sadness that there was, and it's sort of like going back down to this darkness. As much as I like the way these A's are inserted in the discourse, I wouldn't necessarily accentuate them or emphasize them with the left hand more than it's written, because already it's a very low register, and I think it's just used to thicken the paint and to create this very dark paste that goes to a very gloomy place. And I feel like the key to playing these last bars, especially the last one, is once again not feeling any kind of relaxation until the very end, especially for the phrasing. All these syncopations, they want to hold back the discourse, but they are connected with each other, and this is facilitated by the ongoing melody in the left hand.